Alright, hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, and we are going to be going through my list of the top 100 American founders starting right now. Now, it's going to take a little while, and I don't want to waste too much time, but if you're new here, I put out videos about the American Revolution 5 days a week, as well as write articles on my website, founderoftheday.com, 5 days a week. So if you like the American Revolution, definitely hit like, and make sure you subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment as we go. But I am going through 100 founders, plus 10 additional extra founders, so honorable mentions. So it's going to take a little bit. It will probably take about an hour, maybe an hour 15. So the first whole bunch of founders, I'm going to be going through pretty quickly. There are probably people you disagree with. This list changes every year based on what I've researched. So here we go. I'm going to pull up a screen here where we could talk about the American Revolution. And here it is, my list of top 100 American founders. So without further ado, if you are ready, here we go. We're going to start off with some honorable mentions here. Now, most of these people were on lists in the past. This is the third year I've made a list of this nature, so there are probably people, again, it jumps around, believe it or not, based on what I've learned. These are mostly people who have been on the lists in the past. So we have Peyton Randolph, who was the first president of the Continental Congress, a member of the very influential Randolph family, and there will be another Randolph further down on this list, don't you worry. The Randolph family is very important. He passed away. Unfortunately, he passed away just a year after being the first president of the First Continental Congress, so he falls way down the list because he didn't do too much, although he was a leader of Virginia going into the Revolution, so he deserves mention. We have William Richardson Davey, who was a commander of the South, father of the University of North Carolina. William Richardson Davey got into some skirmishes during the American Revolution as a commander. Bannister Carlton referred to him as a hornet. He fought around Charlotte, North Carolina, and he called that area a hornet's nest, and now there's a basketball team called the Charlotte Hornets. Prince Whipple was a slave, actually, to William Whipple, who went to Philadelphia, joined William at the Battle of Saratoga. He actually petitioned North Carolina with 19 other men to abolish slavery in Massachusetts. He was a very important person. He's one of my personal favorite founders, but he did fall down the list for reasons we'll see later. Hercules Mulligan, fans of the play Hamilton are going to be not happy with me because he fell down this list, but there are a lot of people who did a lot of things. Yes, Hercules Mulligan's participation as a spy during the American Revolution, and even in early battles with Alexander Hamilton and the Hearts of Oak early in the war at the Battery in New York were very important, but he does unfortunately fall down this list dramatically. Richard Bland didn't have a lot of part in the American Revolution, but he was writing papers against the king he was very old by the time he was from Virginia, a friend of Peyton Randolph's, very old by the time the American Revolution rolls around. So there we go. He doesn't have a lot to do with the founding, but he was an inspiration to many, many, many American founders. John Laurens. Again, sorry, fans of Hamilton. John Laurens was a young man. He did a lot of good things. He was an aide-de-camp to General Washington, and he went to he went to Europe, the Netherlands, to negotiate with them during the war because his father, Henry Laurens, who is also on this list later, he was captured and sent to the Tower of London while traveling to negotiate in Europe with foreign nations. So John Laurens took his place in Europe. Nathan Hale, again, a name people recognize, not going to be happy he's an honorable mention here, but he was America's first spy, and he wasn't very good at it because he got caught pretty much right away. He is known for the phrase, my only regret is I have one life to live for my country, and he did only have one life, and he unfortunately did not live it entirely long enough. George Taylor, I'm sad he fell down. I'm sad about a lot of people who fall down on the list. George Taylor was an indentured servant who ended up signing the Declaration of Independence. A real rags to riches story, so to speak. He, or more of a pull yourself up by the bootstrap story. He was ran a mill, was a regular person who made his way to the highest echelons of Pennsylvania society. William Woodford. William Woodford was a brigadier general. He won at Great Bridge, which is an important battle in Virginia. It was one of the first American victories, if not the first American victory in the state of Virginia. As always, the most important state in the Union. William Woodford falls off the list. So let's get to the actual list. And like I said, I'm going to try and do less than 30 seconds per person so that we can get through this within an hour 15. So let's see. Number 100, William Whipple. Again, William Whipple was the owner of Prince Whipple. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a general at the Battle of Saratoga, a general in the New Hampshire militia. Again, he brought Prince his slave with him. That story's long. I've discussed it before. If you watch the channel at any length, I really love Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and there how that city kind of went forward with eliminating slavery without laws. They just got rid of it. And William did have a role in helping the black community of Portsmouth establish itself as a free people. Alexander Mcdougall, he was a major general in the Continental Army, really what he's most known for, although off the top of my head, nothing of any particular battles he was leading, but major general, very important. Secretary of the Marine for the Continental Congress, which was also super important, and even before the American Revolution, he was a pamphleteer in New York City. New York City, obviously, is New York City. It wasn't the biggest city at the time of the American Revolution when it started, but it was the biggest city by the time the American founding came to its complete end. Mcdougall, his pamphlets writing early in the war actually started certain battles. The battle of, the name escapes me, but it wasn't even a battle. It was kind of a riot in New York City that he essentially started. Very important. Kasmir Pulaski, I live south of Pulaski, New York. I wish he was higher on this list. He probably should be higher on this list. I have him listed here as the father of the American cavalry. Not only that, but Kasmir Pulaski was also the father, the Polish founding father. He was from Poland. He had actually started a revolution over there and tried to depose a king in Poland. That didn't work out, and he fled Poland, and he ended up in France, where he met Silas Dean, who sent him over to help George Washington establish military on horseback. Robert Howe. Robert Howe was the first general of the Southern Department. The Southern Department ends up being really arguably the most important department in the war, definitely in the second half of the war after Saratoga. Southern Department is the most important part, and Robert Howe early in the war leads it. It doesn't go great. He does end up getting replaced. He tried to invade Florida. I put here that he led a failed invasion of Florida, although the command is hard to establish who led that invasion, which is why it failed. One of the many reasons it failed. Arguments between Governor Button Gwinnett and Major General Lachlan McIntosh, neither of whom found their names on this list, though I really could start putting McIntosh on here. But either way, Howe ran West Point out for a part of the war, and he, at the end of the war, was involved with suppressing several mutinies of the Pennsylvania line and the New Jersey line at the end of the war. Stephen Hopkins, number 96. I have a t-shirt with his quote on it if you want to check out my website down below. My hand trembles, but my heart does not. An old dude with palsy who was, he could barely write because his hands shook so much naturally, but he still was confident about independence. His story is very interesting. Samuel Ward, who was his political opponent forever in Rhode Island, they kept changing who was governor and who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, always fighting. They led the two political parties in Vermont. Then they both join forces and go to the First and then Second Continental Congress. And unfortunately, Samuel Ward, I should say, dies just as in March of 1776. So he doesn't get to sign the Declaration. So Stephen Hopkins was essentially signing the Declaration for himself, his state, and his lifelong political rival who had just passed away. Gunning Bedford. He was a major player at the Constitutional Convention, kind of little, not very big anywhere else, but he did go to the Constitutional Convention and really helped limit the size of the Constitution. He's arguably the small government signer of the Constitution, which is a big government document. Daniel Boone, who we know most people kind of forget is an American founder. He is known for his participation in going to Kentucky and helping found the Western frontier, or at least what was the frontier then. But you keep in mind that this was during the American Revolution, and Daniel Boone served in the American Revolutionary War, so counts as a founder. His name is further down on the list for a name that's that popular because, well, he was kind of a small player in the founding itself. Although maybe, arguably, he could be up there. I see someone left, so I can understand. I might be making people mad. 93. William Ellery signed the Declaration of Independence and Article of Confederation. Actually, Ellery sat down next to Secretary Charles Thompson while they were signing the Declaration because he wanted to look at people's faces while they signed the Declaration to see if they realized the gravity of the situation. Next is Mercy Otis Warren. Unfortunately, one of only 2 women, I believe, that actually made this list. Trailblazing female author. Actually, tomorrow's article, The Anti-Federalist, that I will be publishing tomorrow, and we will discuss in our live video next Wednesday. Make sure you subscribe. Mercy Otis Warren, I'm writing about tomorrow. She's a trailblazing female author. She promoted independence early. She would be an anti-federalist. She would be one of the first women to publish under her real name eventually after the Revolution. She published plays that inspired people to join. And she ended up actually writing one of the first histories of the American Revolution, where she talked trash about her very close friend, John Adams, who was then president of the United States. Ebenezer Hazard, number 91. Postmaster General of the Continental Congress throughout the Revolutionary War, start to finish. Postmaster General the entire time. And this is an amazingly important position. You couldn't call people on the telephone at this point. You couldn't send an email or watch them on YouTube. You had to send a letter. And having a Postmaster General was extraordinarily important. Keep in mind, Benjamin Franklin was the one who originated the postal system in the United States on behalf of the king. So Ebenezer Hazard was essentially taking over a role that Benjamin Franklin had run for decades. And we all know who Benjamin Franklin is. I assure you, he appears on this list. You are going to have to watch this video for a number of minutes to get to Benjamin Franklin. Number 90, Thomas Nelson Jr. organized the Yorktown Tea Party. There were a lot of tea parties. It wasn't just the Boston Tea Party. In response to the Boston Tea Party, there were tea parties in Yorktown, Virginia, Philadelphia. I believe there was one in New York. Up and down the coast, there were lots of tea parties. Thomas Nelson Jr. would go on to become a governor of Virginia. And yeah, that's right. He had his house fired on. The Continental Army was there, had British trapped in his house, and he was like, "No, destroy my house." Like, it's time. Edward Rutledge was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a governor of South Carolina. The Rutledge family is very important. Actually, his brother John is coming later. Benjamin Talmadge has become famous from the TV show Turn, number 88. He was Washington's head of intelligence. He ran the Secret Service. The Secret Service is the wrong way to put it, but he ran the Culper Spy Ring, which is now famous from the show Turn, and the book, and several books now. It's kind of a hot topic. And Talmadge would, as I discussed him in a video earlier this week. Check it out. Daniel Shays, number 87, Shays Rebellion. Now, Shays was not important before or after his rebellion. And in fact, Shays Rebellion had several important leaders. Daniel Shays is just the one whose name is attached to it. And because of that, even though he didn't do a lot for the founding, he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And Shays Rebellion, it scared many founders into writing the Constitution. Number 86, Robert Tree Payne signed the Declaration of Independence and prosecuted the Boston Massacre. So very important during the build-up to the Revolution. And think about it. When the Boston Massacre happens, the Patriots are angry and they get someone important that they trust who's an ardent patriot to prosecute it. That was Robert Tree Payne. Granted, the defendant that Robert Tree Payne lost to was John Adams. That's a different story. Oliver Wolcott. Realize the second T is not bold. That's a mistake. Number 85, Oliver Wolcott. I considered actually moving up this list pretty far. He signed the Declaration of Independence, Major General in the Connecticut Militia, a governor of Connecticut, a really big, important dude. And his son, Oliver Wolcott Jr., who didn't make this because I haven't really written an article on him yet. He was, I believe, the second treasurer of the United States of America, and very important in helping Hamilton and Tedch Coax build the American, the treasury system that Hamilton is famous for. Hamilton did have help, and Oliver Wolcott Jr., this gentleman's son, was one of the people who helped him with it. 84, Benjamin Harrison, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a governor of Virginia. And if you recognize the name Benjamin Harrison, his son, William Henry Harrison, was president, and his great-grandson, also Benjamin Harrison, were presidents of the United States. So if two of your direct descendants were presidents of the United States, you had a pretty big role. James Mchenry. James Mchenry was a surgeon in the Army, a young physician who joined the Army, acted as a surgeon for a regiment, made his way up the ranks, and by the time Washington was president, James Mchenry became Secretary of War for several years during both George Washington and John Adams' administration, and this includes the start of the quasi-war with France. So, that wasn't really a war, it was a quasi-war, but still, James Mchenry was there. I should note that he was with Timothy Pickering, one of the, I'll call them henchmen of Alexander Hamilton, that were kind of controlling the Adams administration from the inside, and eventually gets fired by John Adams for precisely that reason. Where was I? 82, Jonathan Trumbull. Jonathan Trumbull was governor of Connecticut. What's interesting about Jonathan Trumbull is there were royal governors in all the colonies, and then the Revolution broke out, and most of those royal governors fled from the rebels, but not Jonathan Trumbull, actually sided with the rebels and remained governor, and he was the only colonial governor who continued to be governor through the Revolutionary War. A very close ally of George Washington during the war, helped with many things, including raising funds and getting troops. Connecticut was kind of a no man's land, most of it, just like upstate New York and most of New Jersey. And Trumbull played a very important role. Also, Jonathan Trumbull had at least three, if I'm counting right, three sons involved with the American Revolution, one of whom gave us many paintings, and that's how we know how several founders look like. 81. William Blount. William Blount was a signer of the United States Constitution and a founder of the state of Tennessee. I think I made a video about Blount recently. Very interesting character. He ended up going to the Constitutional Convention and left, and went, because he was also in Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia while the Continental Congress was meeting in New York, and he was a member of both. He went to the Constitutional Convention, didn't care for it, and he left. He went to New York City, and while he was there, he signed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is really the only real important legislation passed by under the Articles of Confederation. And then he went back to Philadelphia, and then he signed the Constitution also, and I'm pretty sure he's the only guy who signed both those documents. And then he left. He becomes a founder of Tennessee. He's actually elected a senator from Tennessee before Tennessee as a state goes to the Capitol and convinces the United States to admit Tennessee, at which point they do, and he's there and already a senator. He also was not a governor, he was governor of the territory, and he gave Andrew Jackson his first start in politics as Attorney General of Tennessee when it was first created, and essentially set Andrew Jackson off on a trajectory to make him, Andrew Jackson and whatnot. Let's go. Take a sip of water because I'm talking fast. Number 80, Ethan Allen. I know he is really far down this list, and I apologize. While I'm making this list, I know I'm going to make this video, and I'm thinking, like, some of these more famous names, people are going to be like, how is the Ethan Allen, whose name I've heard of, behind David Brearley, who I've never heard of? And well, I assure you, Ethan Allen was important, especially in the early days of the war, taking Fort Ticonderoga with his Green Mountain Boys. I also have to acknowledge that he was actually captured pretty early in the war and brought over to Europe, and then he came back and kind of stayed out of it. And while he was definitely important to the founding of Vermont, after the first year of the Revolutionary War, he didn't have a lot to do with the war itself. He really just had to do with his state. Furthermore, he was actually not demoted, but other people were given rank above him in the Green Mountain Boys, which made him upset, but was kind of important. Such as Seth Warner, who I don't think made the list this year. That's unfortunate. There's so many good founders to choose from. Now, David Brearley, who you may never have heard of, at number 79, was chairman of the Committee of Postponed Parts at the United States Constitutional Convention. And as chairman of the Committee of Postponed Parts, he was in charge of the several people who, in the last few days of the Revolutionary War, got together and were given these papers of things we can't figure out. Figure them out! And guess what? He did. He and his team figured out these postponed parts, aka by postponed parts, it was like, hey, what should we do with this? I don't know. I think we should do this. I don't think we should do that. What do you think we should do? I don't know. Okay, let's postpone it and give it to David Brearley. And he figured it out. And we have the Constitution. An amazingly important person, despite being so unknown and not, yada, yada, yada. Number 78, Francis Dana. Francis Dana is a lot of fun. He helped organize the Continental Army early in the war. He was an early member of the Continental Congress, and he actually gets sent to meet with Russia. And while we have, like, Benjamin Franklin going to France, and John Adams going to Netherlands and Great Britain, and John Jay going to Spain, you have Francis Dana going to Russia. Now, I'll remind you, you remember from your textbooks, Catherine the Great used to lead Russia. Well, that was the same time as the American Revolution. And Francis Dana went to meet with the Catherine the Great. And she was like, I don't want anything to do with your war with Britain, because we'll get slaughtered in a war with Britain. Actually, side note, instead she created a thing called the League of Armed Neutrality. And she got a bunch of other smaller countries. And I know Russia's really big, but at the time they were a smaller power. She got a bunch of other smaller powers in Europe to agree to band their navies together, kind of like these colonies in the United States were doing. And they were going to support each other. If anyone was attacked, they would support each other. It was called the League of Armed Neutrality. It's super interesting. Not going to get into it now. Number 77, Chaim Solomon. Made a video about him recently. I feel like I've been talking about him a lot lately, so I'll breeze through it pretty quick. But he was a Jewish founding father who essentially funded the Continental Army. There are other founders who get credit for creating the banks and running the Continental Army. But he was the one who, like, hit the streets and got people to donate money, and himself went bankrupt paying for the United States of America to be created. 76, Edmund Pendleton, chairman of the Virginia Convention, which declared independence. Which one was it? I think it was the 5th Virginia Convention, where he was actually chairman when Virginia itself declared independence, and then sent a message to Richard Henry Lee at the Continental Congress saying, hey, why don't you get everyone to say they're independent? It's like, okay. And then he was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I know he seems kind of obscure and not as important as some of these other people, but he was a leader of Virginia at a time when, again, your state was super important, and Virginia was the biggest, most powerful, wealthiest, strongest state. So being Chief Justice of Virginia Supreme Court is more important to the founding itself than, for example, being chairman of Committee of Postponed Parts. Number 75, Joseph Reed. He was a signer of the Declaration and the first president of Pennsylvania. Of course, some of the states, when they were first created, called their governor president. He was essentially the first governor of Pennsylvania. Did many important things. He joined George Washington on Washington's first trip to Boston to take over the Continental Army. Didn't put a lot here. His wife, Esther Reed, actually started the Ladies Association too, which I probably should have acknowledged. But again, there's so many people to get through. Nicholas Gilman is the only person, other than maybe Edmund Pendleton, I think Nicholas Gilman is the only person on this list that I've never actually written an article about. I just keep putting it off. There's so much to say. He served through the entire war. He's from the Gilman family of Exeter, New Hampshire. His house that he grew up in is actually currently the Museum of the American Revolution, I believe it's called. It's super cool, and they have one of the original Purple Hearts there, so you should go see it. His family, the Gilman family, was super important, and that's why he kind of bumps up this list a little bit. But he served throughout the entire war. He went to the Constitutional Convention, served as a Constitution, was one of the original United States Congress people, and a longtime senator and a major builder of the United States. 73, Richard Montgomery. He was a British person who, like many generals in the Continental Army, had come to America to fight in the French and Indian War, and then left, and then resigned his commission eventually, and moved to New York. And he marries into the Livingston family. And he is named a brigadier general. Even though he's hesitant to join the war, he's asked to by his community. And he joins the brigadier general when Phillip Schuyler has to get sick and cannot lead the Northern Army anymore. Richard Montgomery leads the invasion of Canada and does a great job till they get to Quebec, when he immediately has his head blown off. Because of this, he was martyred. And this is in the last days of 1775, like literally New Year's Eve. So news is spreading in early January that he was killed, and he becomes a martyr to the cause. And that's why he's so far up here. And it sucks to say that he's up this high because he died, but he is up here this high because he died, and the influence his death had on the American cause. Elizabeth Freeman, number 72, the second woman, probably the last one, unfortunately, who makes her way up here, and one of the only, if not the only, black people who made their way on here. And so Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mum Bet, I'm going to cut her story way down. It's fascinating, but we're trying to get through these founders. Mum Bet is she's a slave at the Ashley Farm in Sheffield, Massachusetts, and she overhears freedom and liberty being talked about in the Constitution, and she contacts a man named Theodore Sedgwick, who's not on the list, who probably should be, and she works with Theodore Sedgwick to gain her freedom based on the new Massachusetts state constitution. Massachusetts joined the American Revolution, threw off the government, created a new constitution, and in it said something along the lines of every single person's free. And she was like, what's this? And they were like, oh yeah, you should be free. And that her case started the chain of events of freedom suits that led to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts. Extraordinarily important what she did. 71. Nathaniel Gorham played a leading role in the Constitutional Convention as chairman of the Committee of the Whole. Much like David Brearley, he oversaw one of the most important committees creating the United States Constitution. I'm going to make this as brief as I can, but the Committee of the Whole is a parliamentary procedure. You have committees when you're at a convention of sorts. And this committee does that, and this committee does that. Now, there's one committee called the Committee of the Whole, and that's a separate committee that has every single person in the committee. And essentially, the point of this is that people can have open discussion, but if you say something and you're like booed out of the room, for example, if you're Alexander Hamilton and you say, why don't we just have a king? And everyone in the room is like, what are you talking about? That gets removed from the record because you're not saying it on the floor of Congress. You're saying it to the Committee of the Whole. So what they would do is almost every day through the summer of 1787 is George Washington would get up there and gavel the Congress into session. And then he'd announce, they'd go to the committee of the whole, and Washington would step down, and Nathaniel Gorham would step up and lead the debate. And Nathaniel Gorham spent arguably more time leading the debate at the Constitutional Convention than George Washington did. And then they'd make their decision, and he would slam the gavel and say, okay, the committee of the whole's gone, back to the Congress, and Washington would come back up, take his seat at the front of the room, and they'd say, motion to put through the committee of the whole's recommendation, and they'd vote on that. Nathaniel Gorham should be way up higher. I always, I was supposed to come out with this 2 months ago, and I spent so much time kind of anguishing about like where these people should go, and I'm never happy with the result. Number 70, Bushrod Washington, the only other member of the Washington family who ever held a real significant role in the United States government. Other Washington family members had lesser roles, but Bushrod Washington was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. He was put there by John Adams just after about the same time as John Marshall, and he served like Chief Justice John Marshall, who's coming up, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. They served for about 30 years together and almost always voted the same, and they were basically pushing through Federalist policies all the way up through Andrew Jackson, a real thorn in the side of the Democratic Republican Party. Number 69, William Livingston. William Livingston was part of the major Livingston family. He was not only a signer of the United States Constitution, but a longtime governor of New Jersey. He was at the Second Continental Congress, and I don't know if he voted for independence or not. He may have, but he left in the spring to summer of 1776, about when they were voting for independence, knowing independence was coming. He left to go back to New Jersey and start his government. There were a lot of people who were there to vote for independence, and a month later, on August 2nd, 1776, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, were not there, because many of these people said, oh man, we got to go back home to our states. That's way more important than this Continental Congress, and set up our government. Livingston was one of those, and he was rewarded with about a decade of more than a decade serving as governor of New Jersey. Also, his daughter Sarah Livingston would be married to John Jay and has a very famous book of guest signatures. And his other son, Henry Brockholst Livingston, would actually serve with Bushrod Washington and John Jay in the Supreme Court. Essex Hopkins was the first commander of the Continental Navy. I think this is the first pair of brothers that have arrived here. Earlier, I talked about Stephen Hopkins. There was the hand trembles but heart does not guy. His brother Essex Hopkins had a history at sea, and he was the first Commodore of the Continental Navy, and he was the first person who led the Continental Navy. And he did a pretty good job, but was given a lot of crap for it and ended up leaving. As many of the best generals and commodores did earlier in the war, they were treated very poorly because they just didn't have the political skills and connections in the Continental Congress that helped you get ahead at that time. Daniel Morgan, this is a name you've heard. He was a general of Battle of Cowpens, which is arguably the only... and again, I've only been really studying military history for about 2 or 3 years now, but from my understanding, the tactics Daniel Morgan used at the Battle of Cowpens are arguably the only unique military strategic performance of the Revolutionary War. Everything else was standard or had been done before. And I will get into the Battle of Cowpens. I think I made a video about it like a while ago, but maybe I'll make another one soon, but it's too much to get into now. 66, William Moultrie. He won an early battle, what became known as Fort Moultrie. The British were coming in Charlestown, and he cut down palmetto trees and used them as guards, so walls essentially, so that the cannons wouldn't hit his men. And it turned out that palmetto trees are really good because they're soft and they bounce cannonballs off. So his work, he also created a flag on a whim to fly for his men. And the general design of his flag became South Carolina's current state flag. And the state motto, the Palmetto State, is based, to my understanding, largely around William Moultrie's use of the palmetto trees in this battle. Lord Stirling, William Alexander, the only American founder who legitimately had claims to nobility and made sure he told people, because he was William Alexander, but he introduced himself as Lord Stirling. And even George Washington, someone had asked me this, might have been Matthew a while back, how did George Washington reference him? And George Washington, in letters, literally calls him my lord. So he was also ended up being a major general, and Washington trusted him because there were several occasions where Washington would leave the army behind at camp to go to Philly or wherever they were and meet with the Continental Congress. And when he left on several occasions, he left William Alexander, Lord Stirling, in charge of the entire main body of the Continental Army, which I think speaks to his character. Number 64, Henry Dearborn. Like, we're already getting into big names at this point, from at least if you're me. Henry Dearborn wrote an historically important diary. So Henry Dearborn joined Benedict Arnold. As we said before, Richard Montgomery went up to Canada and kind of got shot in the face. He went up through Montreal to Quebec. Benedict Arnold famously went through the wilderness of Maine, which was a very hard struggle. And Henry Dearborn was one of the men who went on that trip. And there was part of that, and he was part of the retreat from Canada. And he wrote a diary, kept a diary that was extremely important to historians. He also had dogs that they had to eat during the tough trek through Maine. And later on, he would go up the ranks and become Secretary of War to the Thomas Jefferson. The entirety of Thomas Jefferson actually kept pretty much the same cabinet the whole time. And Henry Dearborn was his Secretary of War, and then was at several positions, including Secretary of War and I believe Secretary of State in the oh no, I'm confusing with James Monroe. He Secretary of War for Jefferson, and then became senior officer of the United States Army during the War of 1812, which is a war that we won and was very important, and he killed it. 63, James Otis. James Otis is given credit for coining the term "no taxation without representation," though I have heard arguments that it came from other places, including in the South, and it did quickly become just kind of a general sloganeering term. But he was an early opponent of certain changes that were being made in Boston. And he is arguably the person that got the people of Boston super mad. So when Boston is kind of the heart of the early revolution, the other colonies get angry. And then Boston being super angry makes them a little angrier. And Boston helps rile up the other colonies, so to speak. And James Otis is really the man behind that. James Otis is the one who allegedly got Sam Adams super angry and start leading these things. James Otis most certainly was the one who inspired John Adams and Dr. Joseph Warren, who are names we've not seen yet, but they are coming. We're going to pop up here, make sure everything's going fine. Excellent connection. For some reason my chat was disconnected, but that's okay. We're going to keep on going. James Otis. Oops. Wait. Oh, why did I do that? I thought I could scroll down. William Samuel Johnson. Much like James Otis, I forgot to mention, did attend the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. And the Stamp Act Congress is often overlooked, but it's the first time that most of the colonies send representatives to hang out and say, hey, there's a problem here. Let's write a letter to the king and see if he fixes it. And the Stamp Act Congress, they did. Parliament repealed much of the Stamp Act and much of those problems, though they did say we have the right to do this, we're just not going to do it anymore. James Otis was at the Stamp Act Congress, as was William Samuel Johnson. William Samuel Johnson, when things first started getting antsy with Great Britain, he actually got in a boat and sailed across to Great Britain and said, hey, Mr. King. He didn't talk to the king. He talked to Parliament, and he tried to mend those fences. That didn't work. And he came back, and he was seen as a little bit suspicious for a while. Because he had gone and talked to them, but people got over it, and people of Connecticut sent him to the Continental Congress. Also, Vermont was not a state, nor were they a colony. They were nothing. They considered themselves an independent nation. New Hampshire considered them part of New Hampshire, and New York considered them part of New York. But they wanted representation in Congress, and William Samuel Johnson felt their grievances, and he actually came and spoke on their behalf. He was essentially, though he represented Connecticut, Vermont's representative to the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention. Johnson would go on to sign the Constitutional Convention. Number 61, Cesar Rodney, another person from a different state, Delaware, who also attended the Stamp Act Congress. He would then attend the First Continental Congress, and he would go and sign the Declaration of Independence. He had a midnight ride where he rode. He was taking care of loyalists in Delaware, rode overnight through a terrible storm with one eye covered because his face was riddled with cancer. Got there as the sun came up, soaking wet, came into the Continental Congress and voted for independence, giving Delaware enough votes to agree with independence and therefore swaying the entire body. He would also be governor of Delaware, but his disease unfortunately would kill him not long after the war ends. Let's go. Anthony Wayne fought through the American Revolutionary War. spin to myself. A very important leader, officer in the American Revolutionary War, though he does become a little bit more known for his battles out west. Once the Northwest Indian War breaks out in the late 1780s, Arthur St. Clair has St. Clair's defeat and is kind of embarrassed, and George Washington becomes president, chooses Anthony Wayne to go out there and create the Legion of the United States, which the Legion of the United States, there was the Continental Army, and then that dissolved. And then there was no army, and then they created the United States government, and then right as Washington's taken over, the Northwest Indian War is already kind of broken out, so Washington sends Anthony Wayne to start the Legion of the United States, and later on, the Legion of the United States turns into the United States Army. So essentially, Anthony Wayne is the one who created the United States Army, as we more or less know it today. Also, side note, in the early 20th century, there was an actor who wanted a stage name, and he was going to use the name Anthony Wayne because he thought it was cool, but people were racist against Italians back then, and the movie industry said no one's going to watch a movie with a star whose name is Anthony, so he changed his name to John, and his stage name was John Wayne. And John Wayne actually took his stage name from Anthony Wayne. Super fun fact. Number 59, John Paul Jones. Oh man, I'm not even halfway through. Okay, John Paul Jones is the father of the United States Navy. You probably heard his name for being in charge of the United States Navy. 58, George Rogers Clark, father of the Northwest Territory. Fought with Anthony Wayne in the Northwest Indian War. George Rogers Clark overlooked because he fought in the western part of the American Revolutionary War, which, much like the Navy and John Paul Jones, is just generally overlooked when people talk about the American Revolution, but fighting in the West was extremely important. He's also the older brother of William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. 57, Albert Gallatin. If you watch the channel at all in the last few weeks, you know I've been talking a lot about Albert Gallatin. I've been reading a biography of him, Secretary of Treasury throughout the Jefferson and even part of the James Madison administrations, third Treasurer of the United States, and just an extraordinarily important character in the development of American banking. Number 56, Timothy Pickering. I mentioned him earlier with Mchenry. He was important during the war. He was at the Newburgh conspiracy. He was the only one who didn't immediately turn around when Washington was in the room. He was the only one who was like, what? He just says one speech and he changed his mind. He made several important treaties with the Iroquois nation of upstate New York, trying to secure peace. He was a postmaster general. He was Washington's Secretary of War. He ended up being Washington's Secretary of State, and then John Adams' Secretary of State. That's a pretty hefty list. 55, George Read was a signer of the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. The only thing he didn't sign, George Read of Delaware, was the Articles of Confederation. 54, Thomas Mifflin. First aide-de-camp to George Washington, right away. He ends up being the quartermaster general for a good portion of the army until Nathaniel Greene takes over, because Mifflin had become president of the Continental Congress. He ends up being governor or president of Pennsylvania, and additionally signs the United States Constitution. Furthermore, if you've ever seen the television show The Office, you'd know they work in a place called Dunder Mifflin, is the office. And the Mifflin part is, yes, a reference to Pennsylvania's own Thomas Mifflin. Robert Livingston, another member of the Livingston family. The most Livingston family we talk about are brothers. Robert R. Livingston, is a cousin. He was an early supporter of independence from New York. He was served on the Committee of Five that authored the Declaration of Independence, though, as we know, he and Roger Sherman didn't really do much on that particular committee. He did vote for independence, but was one of those people, as I said before, who left early to go back home and never actually signed the Declaration. Still, I'm surprised I put him this low, because he was Chancellor of New York, which was kind of like Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the entire Revolution. People called him Chancellor, and then eventually he leaves because Jefferson asked him to go to France once Jefferson's president, and he works with James Monroe to make the Louisiana Purchase. When he comes back from France, he brings the knowledge of steam power back, and he helps fund the first steam engine that went on the Hudson River from New York City to Albany. He also helped sponsor building the Erie Canal, and the combination of the Erie Canal and Robert Livingston's steamboats made New York City one of the most powerful economic powerhouses in the entire world. Artemis Ward was a leader in Boston as the Revolution broke out, and he was a general in the Massachusetts militia. And when all these militiamen from Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Vermont, soon to be Vermont, and Connecticut, when all these militia Minutemen show up to Boston, they all need to unite under someone. And since they're in Massachusetts, they all kind of voluntarily agree to unite under whoever Massachusetts chooses. And they chose Artemis Ward. So this army of observation that was first after the Battle of Lexington and Concord assembled to hold the British in Boston. Artemis Ward was commander-in-chief of the 1st Continental Army. And I say this because a few weeks later, George Washington is elected as general of the Continental Army, and when he shows up, he doesn't show up with the Continental Army. He shows up and asks the Army of Observation if they want to be the Continental Army. And as leader of the Army of Observation, Artemis Ward turns over the keys to the Continental Army to George Washington to officially create the Continental Army. Also, years later, he would be the second highest ranking. He would be the highest ranking Major General in the Continental Army while he served. He was second only to George Washington during the American Revolutionary War. However, he did fall ill and therefore resigned his commission and went to politics. He ends up going to the Continental Congress for a while and becomes an inaugural, I believe, senator. I think he was an inaugural senator, but it might have been a congressman. But either way, he was an inaugural member of the new United States government after the Constitution was signed. Number 51, George Mason. George Mason is hugely important, influential, wrote the Virginia State Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which Thomas Jefferson was referencing when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he attended the Constitutional Convention, was one of the 3 people there on the last day while everyone signed, and he stood in the corner shaking his head and said no, and went back and fought the Constitution. Okay, I'm going to take a sip of water. We're going to go to the next page. We're 45 minutes in and only halfway through. I'm going to speed this up. Robert Hanson Harrison, George Washington's chief of staff during the Revolutionary War. He was a younger man, but older than most of the people who worked with George Washington in Washington's family during the Revolution. Robert Hanson Harrison was his personal secretary and essentially acted as chief of staff. What we would consider a chief of staff in the United States for presidents today, Hanson Harrison was for George Washington during the war. In fact, in the first presidential election, every elector got 2 votes, and it was a time where whoever got the most won. George Washington got 1 vote from everyone, so it was, quote, unanimous. But the second vote went to whoever. Robert Hanson Harrison got several votes, and it seems to have been because of the way he worked with George Washington during the Revolutionary War. Christopher Gadsden, another person who attended the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, and would go to the Continental Congress, signed the Articles of Association. People call him the Sam Adams of the South. Well, actually, when I had Stephen Coax on to discuss his book a few weeks back, and I asked him what founder needs more respect, Christopher Gadsden is the person he referenced. He created the Don't Tread on Me flag, that yellow flag with the snake on it that says Don't Tread on Me, you see on households across America. Not a lot of people realize that's called the Gadsden flag. 48, George Clymer. He was hired as a treasurer of the Continental Congress, and then actually, while he was there, got elected to the Continental Congress, signed the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Charles Lee, number 47. I put him here as highest ranking Major General for the first half of the war. He was number 2 to the person we were just speaking about, whose name eludes me. Major General Artemis Ward. He was number 2 to Artemis Ward, and then Artemis Ward leaves. And Charles Lee is the highest ranking general in the Army. Now, he has a lot of flaws, and I am not a big Charles Lee fan, but he was, from like 1776 until 1780, the highest ranking Major General in the war. Number 2 only to Washington until he resigned. Excuse me. Pardon me. Number 46, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. General declined to be... He was a general in the war. He declined to be in the first cabinet. He did sign the United States Constitution. He was sent by George Washington to be a minister to France. I think he was there during the XYZ affair. And then he actually ran as a presidential candidate. And I don't think his brother makes it on here either, but he would run as a presidential candidate, and then his brother would also run as a presidential candidate. His brother ran as vice presidential candidate for John Adams, and he ran as a presidential candidate and got absolutely annihilated by the Democratic Republicans. Number 45, Paul Revere. Again, another super famous name that you're probably angry at me for seeing all the way down at number 45, and I apologize for this, but as far as his contribution goes, we've already gone through a lot of names. There are hundreds of people, and 45 is a respectable showing, I assure you. Obviously, you know most about Paul Revere. He did his famous ride, but what's often overlooked is he did a ton of rides. He rode from Massachusetts to deliver things to Philadelphia. He rode to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He rode all over the place. It was more than just the one ride, and actually, the ride he's famous for is arguably his worst ride because he gets arrested. Also, Paul Revere goes on to help institute the Industrial Revolution in Boston, which is, again, something totally forgotten. 44, Horatio Gates. Again, I put here as spent most of the army, most of the war as number 4 major general, an important major general, a thorn in Washington's side. Honestly, I would have wanted to rank him lower, except his involvement in the Conway Cabal and his hampering of General Washington the whole time, and being appointed the president of the Board of War, which essentially told Washington what to do. He was extraordinarily important, even though he would, objectively, I'm not a fan of him. Not objectively. Personally, hate him. And people are leaving. Sorry, that's my opinion. Number 43, John Langdon, a general at Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga, a governor of New Hampshire and a signer of the Constitution, an early rabble-rouser. Actually, for Saratoga, he put a lot of money into it, spent a lot of money on giving to the John Stark, to win the Battle of Saratoga. He did just a lot of financing from the North. Really important guy. Thomas Paine, number 42, Thomas Paine. Again, you guys probably think he should be higher. Author of Common Sense in the Crisis. Yes, he wrote these important things. He would then go to France to be part of the French Revolution, but there's a reason that he was buried with like 6 people at his funeral. Made a lot of enemies. And yes, obviously very important. He authored very important contributions in the first 2 years of the war, and then after that really wasn't that important to the American Revolution. I'm sorry to say he's important to world history, but not necessarily the American Revolution. 41, Lambert Wickes. We talked about John Paul Jones, who's the father of the Continental Navy. Lambert Wickes, if he didn't die, probably would have that credit. He was the most successful officer of the Continental Navy. He got in a boat, went to war, and did warring, and he did off the shores of Britain. He was really sneaky with France. Like, he convinced them to let him hang out there, even though they were trying to get rid of him. Lambert Wickes, extraordinarily important, super underrated. I mean, definitely the most underrated naval officer of the war. Number 40, Edmond Randolph, a governor of Virginia who I talked about recently, attended the Constitutional Convention, came up with the Randolph Plan. He was the first person to speak at the Constitutional Convention, outlined essentially James Madison's plan, and then worked the whole summer, and 3 months later refused to sign the document and went home not happy about it. While he was there, he was like his mid-30s and already governor of Virginia. Washington would have him become the first attorney general and the second secretary of state, though he would kind of resign a little bit disgraced because he got caught talking trash about certain private matters that the cabinet was discussing with the French. Number 39, Aaron Burr. Don't go anywhere. I know, it's crazy. How could Aaron Burr be this high up? Yo, he's the supervillain of the American Revolution, and I assure you he's not the supervillain of the American Revolution. The supervillain of the American Revolution hasn't shown up yet, and he will. Don't go anywhere. Aaron Burr was the 3rd vice president of the United States. You got to remember that when you're thinking of this guy. Like, 3rd. Like, when you're talking about vice presidents of the United States of America, you're talking about John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. And yes, a lot of that was him being a very good politician and making his way up. But don't let what you see in the musicals trick you. He wasn't just some evil villain who shot Alexander Hamilton. Arguably, Hamilton was the bad guy in that whole dispute, arguably. But what's important is that he fought in the American Revolution. He was an important lawyer and politician in early New York. He became one of the, an early, not inaugural, but early senator for New York State. And again, did a lot of important things. Number 38, speaking of New York, George Clinton. George Clinton was governor of New York throughout the founding period. As soon as there was a New York, George Clinton became governor, and he was governor all the way until George Washington was president. The whole war, which meant he was in charge of all the state militia troops and any movements in New York. And there were a lot of battles in New York because there was that no man's land I was talking about between New York City and the rest of the world. He was a leading anti-federalist as soon as they started discussing it. And then later on, would throw that aside after the Constitution was ratified and become the 4th vice president of the United States. Actually, when Aaron Burr was vice president, number 3, and then Jefferson didn't want him around anymore, so number 4, his replacement, was George Clinton. Like, that lines up pretty nicely. I didn't even do that on purpose. Number 37, George Wythe. George Wythe, I said here, educated founders. He was older. He was a mentor to many, like Thomas Jefferson, several other people, eluding my mind right now, actually educated the founders themselves, which is extraordinarily important. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he signed the United States Constitution. But 36, Benjamin Rush was like the doctor of the founders. I put him. There were a lot of physicians involved with the American founding. Benjamin Rush is a very interesting character. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He changed the way medicine is studied. He's considered the father of psychiatry. The father of American psychiatry. He oversaw the building of the first mental institution, which the goal was to treat mental illness as a disease instead of just a crime. He was an abolitionist. He was tried to help women's rights. He did have some, he held on to bloodletting longer than he should, and definitely some of his earlier ideas for improving mental health and dealing with the mentally insane are now considered disgusting and abusive and horrific ways to treat human beings. But he was, as many of these people were, on the cusp of the Enlightenment, at the peak of the Enlightenment, and trying to further scientific knowledge. 35, Oliver Ellsworth signed the Declaration of Independence. Okay, Ellsworth is amazingly important. Signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a governor of Connecticut. He was the a commissioner of foreign affairs, Indian affairs, this and that. He was an inaugural member of the United States Senate, who was the primary mover, along with James Madison, of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the United States judicial system. The Constitution left the judicial system up to the Congress, and he is one of the ones. He was a senator, and James Madison was in the House of Representatives, and they worked together to create the judicial system. A few years later, he was rewarded by becoming an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and then took over for John Rutledge as the third Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. 34, Phillip Schuyler, father of the Schuyler sisters from the Broadway play If That's Your Thing. He was second major general in rank for most of the war. Okay, so I have two people where I said most of the war, because the time frames change. He was second in rank to Artemis Ward. I'm sorry. It was Artemis Ward, Charles Lee, and then Phillip Schuyler. So he was number 3, but then Artemis Ward, as I said, leaves kind of early. And Schuyler spent about 3 years there, resigns after some arguments, and becomes the first senator of New York until replaced by Aaron Burr. Just a very important leader of Albany, New York. 33, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. You've heard of him. Truthfully, I was looking at this earlier today, and I said, you know what? I try not to let famous names affect me. I think Francis Marion is a little high up here because I've let his name affect me, but he was the Swamp Fox, and his important, the second half of the war in the Southern Department, Francis Marion's guerrilla warfare against the British harassed them and got to the point where it really helped Nathaniel Greene dominate the South and eventually culminate in winning the war. So that's why I moved him up here. Now, 32, Tedch Coax. Tedch Coax skyrocketed up this list from last year. Like, he was in like the 70s, and I've been reading about him a lot. He's super interesting. I call him the father of the American economy. I made that up. I think. I don't know anyone else who said it. We give Hamilton a lot of credit for his financial plan that created the United States. But Tedch Coax was his number 2. And Tedch Coax arguably created the plan himself. And I say this because the day before the Constitutional Convention met, the Friday before the Constitutional Convention met, Tedch Coax gave a speech to the Pennsylvania and Virginia delegations outlining exactly what should happen. And it's extraordinarily interesting. I'm not going to get into it now. But Tedch Coax really is the first American economist and deserves way more credit for a guy whose name literally nobody knows. But I put him at 32 on this list, and you've seen some of the names I've skipped. Or not skipped, but gone through. 31, Henry Knox. You know the name Henry Knox, the bookseller who went to war, the pudgy dude who carried cannons with his bare hands, 30 cannons across the United States. I'm exaggerating, but he did earn the right to become a major general in charge of our auxiliary because of his great cannon train, moving that across the United States. When George Washington resigned his commission, 8 years later, 8 years later, George Washington resigned his commission. Henry Knox is the one still there who takes over as the head of the Continental Army. Later on, he works as Secretary of War for the Continental Congress, and then he becomes George Washington's first Secretary of War, an extraordinarily important person. I need a quick sip of water as we go. Number 30, Henry Lawrence. Maybe a little higher on this list than he should be. Who knows? You know. Tell me what you think. Henry Lawrence was a father of John Lawrence, who was only an honorable mention, but I moved Henry Lawrence up a little bit because, to give his son credit. And also, he was so important. He was from South Carolina. He was a president of the Continental Congress for a while. He gets imprisoned. He goes to Europe to negotiate with other countries, ends up getting imprisoned in the Tower of London, which is tough. I at one point claimed he was the only person there. I have since been told that no, Ethan Allen also had to stay in the Tower of London, so I apologize for anyone who saw that a year ago. I'm here learning too. Henry Lawrence was imprisoned in the Tower of London. When he gets out, he goes to Paris, and he helps negotiate the Treaty of Paris. Now, he didn't sign it because he was not an official delegate elected by the Continental Congress for that specific discussion, but he was in the room when it was signed, making him the first person to know it was signed. Number 29, John Rutledge. As I said, we talked about his brother Edward Rutledge before. John Rutledge, another person who attended the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 as a young man, would then sign the Articles of Association, aka the Continental Association, after the First Continental Congress, go to the Second Continental Congress. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence. He was one of many, many people who left after independence was voted for to go take care of his home state, where he helped write the Constitution of South Carolina, became the first governor of South Carolina. He would stick around. He would go to the Constitutional Convention and sign the United States Constitution, and then he would go and become an inaugural member of the United States Supreme Court under the Jay Court. And then when John Jay retired, John Rutledge was temporarily appointed as the second Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it didn't turn into a permanent job because he said some negative things about the Jay Treaty and therefore George Washington in public, and then he tried to kill himself by jumping into the water. But luckily he survived and kind of retired in a quiet life. But what I just said, I say it very quickly, but we're talking about 30 years here. From the Stamp Act Congress in his late 20s, through independence, through governorship, through the Constitution, through being on the United States Supreme Court, to being Chief Justice 30 years later. An extraordinarily important person who's often overlooked. And many of you are leaving because you've probably read number 28, Benedict Arnold. I understand. What is Benedict Arnold doing at number 28? Benedict Arnold was an American hero, and I'm sorry to break that to you, but he was. That's what made his treason so important. Was if it weren't for Benedict Arnold, I'll say it, the Americans probably weren't winning the Revolutionary War because of his work in Canada and his work taking Fort Ticonderoga, his work building the first navy on Lake Ticonderoga, Lake Ticonderoga, building the first navy, like basically by hand, just chopping down trees with his team, and then the Battle of Saratoga. The Benedict Arnold's role was so important, and that's what makes his treason so important. I can put him off this list and say he's not one of the top 100 most important founders. Why would he be? He's a traitor. Then his treason wouldn't mean jack. There were plenty of people who were just traitors. They're not on this list. Benedict Arnold's on this list because he wasn't just a traitor. He was a war hero. He was the soldiers looked up to him. Common people looked up to him. He was just a little bit selfish, and that's, again, what made his treason so important. Excuse me. We've been here an hour, so I'm going to power through it. Charles Thompson, he was the Secretary of the Continental Congress from day one to day last. It was a hired position. He was one of the few people being paid to be there, well, at least by the Congress itself. And extraordinarily important, he did all the work. He attested to every document, including John Hancock's famous big signature on the Declaration of Independence. That was just the first copy before everyone else signed, except for Charles Thompson, signed that copy attesting to it. Rufus King, another needs to be paid attention to, signed the U.S. Constitution, an inaugural senator from New York State, even though he grew up in Massachusetts. He was a minister to Great Britain for a while, and later on, against James Monroe, he would technically be the last Federalist president. I say here before the party collapsed. Really, the party had already collapsed, and he was like a token candidate. 25, Joseph Warren. I love me some Joseph Warren. Shout out to Christian Despigna and Founding Martyr, the wonderful book. Joseph Warren, early rebel, wrote the Suffolk Resolves, which, when Paul Revere showed up in Philadelphia with them, steered the direction of the Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress. and he was appointed as a major general in the militia. And the Battle of Bunker Hill, they kept saying, serve as major general, tell us what to do. And he said, no, I'm going to go be a private. I'm going to serve in the front lines. His quote is, I want to die up to my knees in blood. And he did. And he was another martyr to the cause, a very important one. And as Christian Jaspigia has argued in my, I have a great interview with him on here in my channel somewhere. And he argues that, I said before, Artemis Ward handed over the keys of the Armory of Observation to George Washington. Christian actually argues that Joseph Warren is the one who was supposed to be. Washington showed up like a few weeks after he dies, and he was the one leading the revolution that Washington was supposed to go meet. 24, Baron von Steuben, Prussian general, kind of sounds like he was gay, and that's why he left Prussian army, because they didn't want him around, and he went to France, and he thought they would be cool, and France was like, no, get out of here. And it just so happens that Silas Dean was there signing people up for the Continental Army. So Steuben comes over, doesn't speak any English, but he not only turns the American rebels into a makeshift volunteer army, he turns them into the Continental Army. And he literally writes, I think it was called the Blue Book is the shorthand for it, the book on how to be a part of the American Army. And that was the basis of the American Army for a long time. He also did things like rearrange camp so that the toilets weren't just uphill from the kitchen and things like that, because the toilets were holes in the ground. That's really gross. and amazingly important person when it comes to actually building George Washington's army for George Washington. 23, Marquis de Lafayette, America's favorite founding Frenchman. If you've come this far in this video, you know who Lafayette is. John Sullivan, general who led the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, one of the most important people from New Hampshire, joined the war, had a few setbacks during the war, but led the upstate adventure against the Iroquois, was a member of the First Continental Congress and signed that, the Continental Association, and was twice governor of New Hampshire, just an extraordinarily important guy. Number 21, James Wilson, another name that you could probably like, how is he? Who is that and why is he up there? James Wilson was probably, arguably, I'd say the third most brilliant legal mind in Pennsylvania while they were creating the Constitution. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, did a lot of authoring of the Constitution itself, hard to understate, and Associate Justice of the first United States Supreme Court, for good reason. Okay, we're in the top 20 here. Let's see if we get through them. Take a sip of water. You'll recognize that first name. John Hancock. Obviously, I did something wrong here because it says rich kid turned revolutionary, famous. I had to shorten some of these to fit them on the page, so obviously I didn't delete the whole thing. John Hancock, famous signature is what I was going for there. He was an early president of the First Continental Congress, a leader in revolutionary Boston. Like I said, one of the wealthy leaders of Boston that joined the rebels and helped steer other wealthy people in other colonies and in Boston and Massachusetts to join the cause. Number 19, Richard Henry Lee, Virginia leader. He is the one who went to the Continental Congress and motioned that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance with the British Crown, yada, yada, yada. And just for saying that would make him important, except he would later be, he would stay in the Continental Congress a long time, be president of the Continental Congress. His younger brother, Francis Lightfoot Lee, who did not make this list, also a signer of the Declaration, which Richard Henry Lee signed, would serve as a team and be like very important leaders. There were kind of two parties happened. There were two political parties in all but name found their way into the Continental Congress, and Richard Henry Lee was a leader of one. He also had two brothers serving overseas, William and Arthur, who were important, if not thorns in for Ben Franklin's side. Number 18, Gouverneur Morris. He helped write the Articles of Confederation, wrote the United States, the New York Constitution, and then he is the one who drafted the United States Constitution because he had very good penmanship, and he actually wrote the preamble. So when you hear like "We the people of the United States," you are hearing the words of Gouverneur Morris. He also ended up being one of the first ministers to France during the George Washington administration. Side note, he lost a leg during the American Revolution, not fighting in the war, falling out of a carriage, and that didn't stop him from being a ladies' man. He had many women in his life who he consorted with. He's an extraordinary character. One of the people who, there might be some bias here because he's one of the people who got me into the American Revolution when I read the Richard Brookhiser biography, Gentleman Revolutionary, which I suggest everyone read. It's probably somewhere behind me, but I don't have time to find it. We're running long here. Signed the Articles of Confederation. He also had he was the same height as George Washington, so when they made a statue of George Washington, they used his bust, everything except his head, to make George Washington. 17, Sam Adams. I mean, this might sound pretty far down the list, but if you look at some of these names coming up, like, we got some serious names here. So, the loudest voice in creating the revolution, you know who Sam Adams is. There's a beer named after him, signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation. After the war, stuck to state politics, but he was arguably the one who cried the loudest about Boston's, and I don't mean to sound negative, cried. I mean, like, exclaimed Boston's issues the loudest so that other states heard. And he's the one who got other colonies to say, okay, we're all suffering from these problems. Massachusetts is suffering the hardest, but if this is what they're doing to Massachusetts, why are they going to stop before they come here? Okay. 16, John Marshall. Fourth Chief Justice of the United States, was a low-level politician in the early years, but in the 1790s finds his way up, becomes Secretary of War and then Secretary of State for the John Adams administration, and then, of course, becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from like 1800 until well into Andrew Jackson, the 1830s. And arguably, it's hard for me to even put Marshall down this far. Arguably, John Marshall did more than any other single person to format the United States government that we currently live under. Because when they didn't know how the Supreme Court and the judicial system was supposed to go when the Constitution was written, like I said, it wasn't until afterward that they even wrote the laws, the Judiciary Act of 1792. I'm sorry, 1789. Got it. So the court system was kind of in flux, and John Marshall came in and said, no, this is how it works, and it still works the way John Marshall said it should work. So he is extremely important. Number 15, James Monroe. A name you might say, well, why is James Monroe above some of these other people? Like, really? He's more important than Sam Adams? Yeah, he was the 4th president of the United States, and he fought in the war. He almost died in the war as an 18-year-old. But he survived, and he became important in state politics. He actually ran against James Monroe for the first seat in their county for the United States House of Representatives. James Madison for the first seat in their county, which he lost, but either way. And he was president for the era of good feeling, and essentially the end of the American Revolution was overseen by James Monroe. Number 14, Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. He is basically the one who got average people in Virginia, as I said, the most powerful and important state in the Union, to support fighting a war against the king. He would later also go on to smell a rat at the Constitutional Convention. Now, number 13, Silas Dean. And I know what you're thinking. How is some dude I've never heard before, unless you've watched this channel where you hear me shout his praises pretty frequently, how is he up this high? Silas Dean went to the First Continental Congress and signed on board to that, and then he left. Because he was kind of voted out by Connecticut because he had an argument with Roger Sherman. And Ben Franklin called him on his way out of Philly and said, hey, I got an idea. Why don't you join this secret committee I made up? The Continental Congress made it up, but George Washington recruited him to be the correspondent for the secret committee. And he was the first person to go to France on behalf of the United States in secret because they couldn't tell Britain he was involved. And while Ben Franklin would later follow him to France and work together with him, Ben Franklin gets all the credit for getting France on board, but Silas Dean did most of the work. He's the one that sent us Lafayette. He's the one who sent us Steuben. He also sent us many other generals who didn't work out so well. And then when he returned with the might of the French Navy and an ambassador from France recognizing American independence. This is a gentleman who read the Declaration of Independence in a foreign land and brought France to help secure independence. And he would be actually pushed forth as a side note in his own time and has kind of a tragic ending. Number 12, Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry is another one of these guys who was there the whole time. And he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a leader in Massachusetts during the war, and then he went to the Constitutional Convention, though he was one of 3 people, and the only one not from Virginia, who stayed the entire time of the Constitutional Convention and was there when they signed on September 17th and stood in the corner with his arm crossed saying, I will not sign that. And then he went out and argued against the United States Constitution. vehemently. And then that didn't work out, so they send him to the government. He actually represents Massachusetts, yeah. And then contributes most of the Bill of, or a large portion of the Bill of Rights comes pretty much directly from Elbridge Gerry's demands. Then he becomes a minister to France, where he's part of the XYZ affair. And even though two of the three American people there talking to France come home and talk trash about him, so he looks bad, but he stays and tries to make things work. And then he comes back to the United States, and eventually he's chosen as the 5th Vice President of the United States of America, serving under James Monroe, despite having been associated with the Federalists a little bit. Elbridge Gerry is best known for the phrase gerrymandering, which happened while he was governor, and he signed off on it despite having many public reservations about the idea of gerrymandering districts. And unfortunately, his name is that. He's associated with that, and he shouldn't be. He should be associated with Declaration of Independence, Constitutional Convention, Minister to France, Vice President of these United States of America. Moving on, number 11, Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene, I would argue, was the main major general who won the Revolutionary War. Benedict Arnold at Saratoga was very important. Obviously, the battle at Yorktown won the war, but it was Greene's very interesting movements during the Southern battles that led to America really trapping Cornwallis at Yorktown. So he deserves so much credit for winning the American Revolution, and Nathaniel Greene's name is often kind of overlooked when you're talking about some of these other, and I'll say it, sexier names. But he is the last person off the top 10 list because of how important he was to win the war. He was also, Quartermaster General. So he was in charge of like funding the army, or supplying the army too, but he said he'd only take that position if he could keep serving in the field. Now, we're going to go to top 10. I'm going to take a sip of water while you look at number 10. Roger Sherman. I didn't end up writing anything in the bottom here. Probably could have. Roger Sherman is the, and you know what, can I do this? Does this work? Let's see if this works. Am I bigger? We'll see. Roger Sherman was he was there the whole time. Roger Sherman is the only American founder to sign all 4 major documents of the Revolution: the Articles of Association after the First Continental Congress, the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He was also an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. And he is, as I've said recently, very important to weights and measures and gold standard and things like that. Okay, I could go off on Roger Sherman all day. I am not going to. You know what? It did work. I'm going to move this in the middle. There, that looks nice. Does that look nice? Let me know if that looks nice. Or if it made you sick watching me move. Roger Sherman. I'm going to keep moving. I could talk about Roger Sherman literally all day, but I won't. He is one of the most important American founders. Number 9. Oh, I'm still on this. Oh, I hope I didn't screw anything up. Robert Morris. Now, Robert Morris actually fell down the list a little bit this year, and I know he's at number 9 out of 100, so it's not that far down. Robert Morris was the financier of the American Revolution. He spent much of the war as both Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Finance. Minister of the Marine. So, just extraordinarily important. Built the Continental, which is the currency, tried to fund it, kept it afloat as best he could, ran into a lot of issues, but just one of the wealthiest people in Philadelphia who by the end of the war had spent almost his whole fortune. And then he invested in speculation, which didn't work out for many of the founders. John Jay, who's moved up the list this year, only by 2 spots. But I have realized recently, and again, my book of the week, and I forgot to put the link in the bottom, but as I said yesterday, my book of the week is John Jay by William Fair. He was another person who supported independence and then left the Continental Congress because he didn't think signing a document was a big deal. He wrote the New York State Constitution. He goes to Spain and works with Spain, who we don't hear a lot about because they were all a lot of trouble. But he worked with Spain then. He came back to the United States. He becomes Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And briefly President of the Continental Congress. He works with Spain again. Then he ends up eventually, as you know, becoming the first Chief Justice of the United States of America. And while he was the first Chief Justice of the United States of America, he went to Britain as envoy extraordinaire, and he negotiated the Jay Treaty, which not a lot of people like, but it was an important treaty. And while he's there, Chief Justice of the United States in Britain negotiating a treaty, he's elected governor of New York State. And he actually resigns Secretary, Chief Justice to go be in New York State, yada, yada, yada. Probably the most underappreciated founder, other than number 7. John Dickinson. John Dickinson. John Dickinson. Remember that name. If there's one name you come away from this with, it's John Dickinson. And funnily enough, I've been writing this for weeks. And it was just last night I started watching a 3-part thing. There's a library, I forget the woman's name, but they are doing a John Dickinson thing online. NP everyone left because I couldn't think of what I was saying. John Dickinson is extraordinarily important. You should know who he is. He attended the Stamp Act Congress. He wrote farmers' letters early in the 1760s, inspiring people to rebel against the crown a little bit. He was there for the First Continental Congress. He was there for the Second Continental Congress, did not vote for the Declaration of Independence. He did not like what they were talking. He did not think it was time to leave because they didn't have another government. Speaking of which, he was the one who wrote the Articles of Confederation. And then later he would go and serve at the United States Constitutional Convention. I can't, there's not enough I can say about him. Number 6, we're in the big 6. I should have made a bigger deal about this. That's a name you certainly recognize. This is what I call the big 6. And now we're getting to the part where you're really going to hate what I have to say, many of you. For example, James Madison. They're number 6. Are you kidding me? The father of the Constitution, the 4th president of the United States of America, is just one above John Dickinson. First of all, chill out. John Dickinson is that important. I put him above John Jay and Robert Morris. Keep that in mind. James Madison, obviously important, a member of the first government. Madison, however, he was not a part of the war. And although he did write the Bill of Rights, I get it. Like, he's at number 6, and we've gone through, with the honorable mentions, 110 people by this point. So cut me a break. He did write, Bill of Rights and had a huge hand in the Constitution, and then would be president of the United States. But nothing. But he doesn't quite match up to some of these people coming next, in my personal opinion. Sorry, guys. Allie Ham is number 5. And the reason he steps above James Madison just a little bit is because they both worked on the Constitution together and basically had an equal part in writing the Federalist Papers and getting the Constitution to get passed. However, first of all, Hamilton actually served in the war while James Madison was, going to college. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But he gets a little one up there. He earns George Washington's trust. And then he becomes Secretary of Treasury while James Monroe can't even get Virginia to send him to the Senate. He ends up in the House of Representatives, where, again, he writes the Bill of Rights, very important. But Alexander Hamilton creates the Treasury Department and the Assumption Plan. And I like to say this, if you live in the United States right now in 2020, you live in Hamilton's America. Because it's under the Constitution he wanted, and it's the financial plan he devised. He wanted a big government where banks had a lot of power and such. And I see people leaving because they probably disagree with me. We live in Hamilton's America to a very, very, very large degree. And he led the Federalist Party, which was important, and Madison kind of defaulted to Thomas Jefferson once he comes back. So, without further ado, number 4 will probably shock a lot of you, being ahead of both James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. John Adams was the number 4 most important person in the United States. And I could say this without any quarrel, because despite not going to the Constitutional Convention, the United States Constitution in large part reflects his thoughts on government, which he wrote to help several states write their original constitutions back in 1776 after he signed the Declaration of Independence. Also, I can say this with authority because when people voted for the first president of the United States, obviously George Washington got the most votes. John Adams got the second most votes. He had just gotten back from a decade outside of North America. And he came back to the second most votes for first president of the United States of America. And then, when George Washington resigned, the people of the United States of America said, who do we think can replace George Washington? And after all agreeing, no one, they went with John Adams. He had some troubles because anyone who's going to replace George Washington is going to have some troubles, especially when your vice president / best friend starts talking trash about you pretty publicly. That's not going to make things go swimmingly. And also when Alexander Hamilton's henchmen, as I said before, Timothy Pickering and James Mchenry, are causing you trouble from within your cabinet that you inherited from George Washington, and in an effort to keep solidarity in the United States, kept them on board, you're going to have a bad time. John Adams is the fourth most important and influential American founder, and in many ways, his life still affects the life we live today. Number 3. This one you might be able to guess. If you've been process of eliminating so far, you might be able to guess who comes next. Tommy J. He wrote the Declaration, man. There's not much to say about that. Other than that, he's in a very similar situation to John Adams, except when John Adams had one tough term as president, well, John Adams had 2 terms. One not so tough. The other one got a little tougher. Second terms generally seem to be harder. He's Thomas Jefferson. He's the biggest hypocrite in the United States of America. Wants a very strict reading of the Constitution, then, buys the Louisiana Purchase. But he bought the Louisiana Purchase. So there's that. Granted, that buying the Louisiana Purchase was essentially a treaty, is the way they worked around it. But Thomas Jefferson, for so many reasons, number 3. So that leaves 2 people. There's 2 people I haven't mentioned yet. Their names are Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. And you're definitely going to get mad at me for the reasons I chose. Or maybe not. Maybe you'll like it. Number 2. Oh, I missed. Oh, the suspense. I missed my space bar. Number 2 is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is the first American. I mean, by the time the revolution breaks out, he's already in his, 60s? Late 60s? Going on 70? No. By the time the revolution, he's going on 70. Yeah, he was born in 1707, I think. So yeah, the revolution breaks out. He's already going into his 70s. And he's been retired for 30 years because he was so important so early in his life that he was able to retire at 41. So this dude's been retired for 30 years. And the whole time has been using his vast fortune to help build a postal service, build fire departments, build public hospitals, help charitable for the needy. He's already finished writing his almanacs. In addition to that, back when he was still working, he was writing almanacs that all the other founders read growing up. When John Adams meets Benjamin Franklin, he had read Poor Richard's Almanac as a young man. Benjamin Franklin was internationally famous, which wasn't just unique for America. It was kind of unique at all back then. When he arrives in France, his picture is already on china and stamps and literally anything you can imagine. The French had already put his face on. He helped. I gave Silas Dean a lot of credit, and he deserves it, but he helped get the French on our side. He signed the Treaty of Paris. He helped end the war. And he came back. He also signed the Declaration. I skipped over that. And he signs the United States Constitution. Granted, he was at that point going on 90 and not extraordinarily involved, but he was there. And that leaves George Washington. George Washington is the first citizen. Ben Franklin was the first American. George Washington was the first citizen. And he is the spitting image of what every human being should try and be. Now, I will acknowledge he did own slaves and human beings, and that's garbage. But Washington was part of the Enlightenment, and he was learning exactly what would happen, exactly how things worked. And he grew with the idea of independence. He was born into a world of slavery. And by the time he dies, he writes in his will that upon the death of his wife, he would liberate his slaves, because times had changed, and he understood those changes. And he was a man of character, and his character said this is wrong, and we have to figure out a way to do it. He did what he could. Couldn't solve the problem right away. It would take 80 years in the Civil War to solve that particular problem. But he was a man of character, and he He had the opportunity to march on Philly and take over as dictator, and instead he went home to retire. And that's why he became president. Everyone admired him for this. And for a million reasons, Georgie Washington. So we made it. It was about an hour and a half. Okay, I did it in an hour and a half. Not bad. I know it's a long time. I apologize. But I had a lot of fun. I sure hope you did too. I'll blow myself up big right here. I'm getting a little sweaty. That's okay. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new here, definitely subscribe. I don't always put out videos that are this long. Although Wednesdays and Fridays, I do like hour-long live videos. Fridays, we do an amazing trivia night. It's going to be a lot of fun. You better show up tomorrow. On Wednesdays, I review the articles I published in the previous week. So I'm always writing new articles and learning more things about the American Revolution. So definitely subscribe to the channel if you're new here. If you're already here, hit like. I would love a like. That helps you get notifications. Oh, hit the notification bell. That'll help you get notifications. Blah, blah, blah. I can't talk anymore. I've been talking for an hour and a half now. Thank you guys so much for watching. And I'll be back with our live trivia event tomorrow. So I really hope you show up. Thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow.